Well, as is quite customary for me when I return home from work, I spent last evening weathering a blizzard actually, which was actually nice for a change. I rather enjoy the occasional blizzard, but with old friends. And a large number of my old friends from high school, not a large number, but a decent number of them, the ones I was spending time with last night, are in the military. Either were in the military or in the military presently. Um, and talking to them about their experiences and people they know's experiences. Granted, this is going to be largely anecdotal, but I've long wanted to make a video about my impressions about what they say. Um, Mostly along the lines of that the whole recruitment policy of the military is a huge example of bait and switch. It takes advantage in a way, um, I'd say, far more callous and destructive than even the most shameless advertisers on the biases and weaknesses of their target audience, which is basically young men, basically boys, who are either um, in late high school or maybe just past it. Uh, and I'll premise this, if many people see this video other than my subscribers, they may well point out, not totally without justification, that I don't have any first-hand experience. I was never a member of the military. I never really seriously even considered doing so. I mean, who hasn't thought in their mind at some point, the possibility, yes, but seriously considered no. Um, so even though I have lots of friends, including some best friends and a few relatives who have done it, I personally haven't done it. And then the other thing I like to say is, please no comments about, quote, serving your country. When you're in the military, you're saying that equates or equivocating that with serving your country carries a couple implications that are rather unsupportable. When you are in the military, you are just working for the government, and working for the government does not necessarily, and I would argue never actually is, but at the very least doesn't necessarily mean you're serving the country. Firstly, a service is only a service if both parties agree to the transaction. So I can come and say, hey, I'll shovel your driveway if you give me, just to stick with the blizzard theme here, uh, for $20. If you agree, then I've rendered you a service. If, on the other hand, I come and I shovel your driveway, knock on your door and say, I've just shoveled your driveway, you owe me $20, and you say, honestly, I didn't need it shoveled, or I was going to do it myself, or whatever else, then I didn't provide you a service. Uh, Taxes always take the form of the latter scenario, and so it can't really be called a service. Uh, Second, the policies of the government are very debatable in terms of their efficacy for the country as a whole. They serve political interests, definitely, uh, because otherwise the politicians wouldn't order them to do what they do. But I don't think it should be too much of a stress to maybe suggest that the political goals of those in charge of the military, the president and the Congress, aren't necessarily the same thing as what's best for the country. And I think most pro-military people out there who have some, at least rhetorical, suspicion of government and the federal government would at least be willing to admit the possibility that perhaps government policy is not necessarily the same thing as what's best for America or the country, in which case troops performing their orders to enact such a policy is not necessarily serving the country. And that leaves wiggle room for maybe the hypothetical possibility that they are, something that I don't agree with, but I mean, it's there. But to just assume that working for the government equals serving your country, I think, is totally erroneous. But be that as it may, not everything I want to say here is completely anecdotal. Um, Now, the slogan, I don't know if this is still their catchphrase, but it was for a very long time, was to, quote, be all that you can be. And when I was in high school and in the first few years after that, I didn't have a lot of basis for really viscerally thinking otherwise. I mean, you go, you supposedly get in shape. Something I found out is not necessarily always the case. You learn some proficiency with firearms, which is something I think is great, although I also found out that is not necessarily always the case. And then you are very likely to be offered up certain world experiences that are probably good for character, traveling the world, getting to see places, challenging situations. Now, that's not uniform, and of course, thrown in there is a whole bunch of other life experiences that would have less positive impacts on your character. Let's just put it at that. But I didn't have a big reason to really see it as a situation, as an institution that was wasting people's lives, so to speak. Even I'm not talking about the people who die. I mean, obviously their lives are wasted, but the people who come back. But a couple years after high school, as the people in my class basically started to return, and I started to interact with them in their post-military careers, something very odd happens. Because if you watch the commercials, the implication, very explicit in many of them, is you go in the Army or the Marines or whatever it is, and then, or the National Guard, and then you get done and you're basically way ahead in life. You'll get a whole bunch of money for a career to go to college, and you'll end up being a doctor or a lawyer. And all the imagery that you're fed is of a high functioning, successful person who has not only become high functioning and successful, but is also engaged in this very altruistic service to the country. But all the military people I have known have come back, and after their experience with the military, they are in the exact same position, financially and in terms of their career, as they were when they finished high school. Like, literally, they come back and they go and get the same job that they left, only if they had not ever left, they would have been promoted or gotten a better job. I mean, literally, to the same gas station, to the same restaurant, to the same fast food joint, every example I can think of. They come back and they're not doctors and lawyers or whatever. They come back and they move back home. They don't have tons of money. And the ones that go to school, they very rarely want to go to school, because if you think about it, when I went to school, to college, after I was there for 3 or 4 years, I started to feel like this is an anchor on my life. I am delaying my life. I'm delaying childhood in a way, even though I was earning my way and paying for everything myself and working 2 jobs. I still felt like, look, I'm like, reality isn't setting yet. I'm stuck in this bubble world that is higher education, and I want to move on. Well, if you join the military, you're in that bubble world, and yes, it's violent, and there's certain aspects of it which are not like college, but it's a totally government-run institution. You don't have to worry about getting fired or anything like that, unless you literally commit a crime, and even then, sometimes not even that at that point. And then you come back, and after 3 or 4 years or however long it's been, and then at that point, the idea of then going to college and starting 4 years is very, very, it's not very appealing. You're coming back and you're about to start something that all your friends from high school are completing, or the ones who are even smarter, who just got jobs, are now at mid-management levels, and maybe they'll hire you as a hand. So you become an unskilled employee or a poor potential student, because also you've just spent 4 years not being a student, which makes it harder to just jump in to become one, usually, for most people. There's probably exceptions to this. And, so all the ones I've known, the whole school thing is very, very uninteresting and unappealing after they've done a stint in the military, because they're already old enough that, okay, I'm in my mid-20s now, not my late teens. Suddenly, that's the time when you want to be settling down, when you want to get your career, should already be well in the way. And so what these guys end up doing, like I said, all the ones I know, they go back to jobs that they basically left in high school, jobs that they were holding since, maybe they were in the 10th grade. They left after their senior year because they joined the military, and they come back and like literally they're going back to the same fast food joint, the same gas station, whatever it was, and they're starting in the same job. The people who their coworkers before have all moved on, or they've been promoted. So they may have even, they may have been like a manager or something. They leave, and their former employees are now the head managers. You know, and the friend I was visiting, he came back and he spent about 6 to 9 months at his old job, just realizing this. I basically now I don't have a head start. I am behind. Everyone else has moved on. When he came back, I was in college, but I was almost finished. So he's looking at a marathon he's about to have to run if he wants to go to college. All of his coworkers, or co-classmates, all his peers, are past that point. So what he ended up doing was just going back into the military, and that's where he is even today. He's basically making a career out of it. And one thing I learned in my discussions with him is that by him not getting a degree, he is always going to be an NCO, never a CO, which means the ceiling, the vertical advancement that he can achieve is pretty low. The only way for him to get to be commissioned in a routine way, there are other ways, but without him doing some extraordinary feat, would be to go to college, and he really is not in that. So the CO positions are going to go to people who are basically higher class than he is, and so it doesn't even matter how much time he puts in. There's a ceiling to how high he can go, and it's not that high. And the other thing is, this college thing. Some of these guys, they go, oh, $50,000, $60,000 for college. They get done, and they realize they don't want to go to college, and so they say, oh, can I just have the money then and not have the college? And they can't. That's in the contract. And so basically, it was a huge bait and switch. This big bonus that they've kind of imagined getting, they never got. Now the other thing, and I think this plays on their on the weaknesses of younger people, is the sums of money that the military promises. They talk about these tens of thousands of dollar figures, and when you're just out of high school, that sounds like a lot of money. If you just had like a minimum wage job making, if you're my age, the minimum wage was like $5, $4.90 or something like that. But even now, $7 an hour. You're gonna your weekly paycheck for part-time jobs is gonna be $100 or $150 or whatever. And you hear $60,000, it sounds like you fucking won the lottery. But that's for years. That's for years of basically slavery, where you have to live where they say, you have to do what they say, you have to get all the medical treatment that they like. You don't get to quit. I mean, it's possible, but it's a bigger deal than quitting any other job you're ever going to have. If they just kept a menial job but worked more hours, like instead of going 20 hours a week like they might have done in high school, but just worked full time, they would easily make double, triple, the amounts that the military is promising, and you'd only have to work 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. When you actually parse out the wages, they're pathetically tiny, the remuneration that you receive. Like, but when you get a normal job, your normal job number says you're going to make $60,000 a year. They're going to say you make this much per hour. But if the military told you how much per hour you were going to make, it would be like $1 or $2. It would be probably 3 or 4 times less than you're going to get even at the least skilled, lowest paying jobs. And that's assuming that you don't get a better job, which most people do. As you acquire skill, even in low skilled jobs, even at your Burger Kings and your McDonald's and your whatever, you get better at it. You get to the top of the pay scale there, which isn't super high. But then from there, you go, okay, I'm a manager of a Burger King. Maybe I'm qualified to do something else that pays a little bit better. And you're probably right. You probably are. And eventually, if you try, you will get that. Military promotion's much harder. It takes a lot longer, and it just doesn't go as high. And the pay is a lot lower. So the be all that you can be, you become dependent. You're dependent on a welfare, or basically a government check, which isn't that dissimilar from a welfare check. You're not subjected to the discipline of the market, so you can be a lot more lazy. Uh, like you pass your PT test and then you don't have to pass it again for years sometimes, and so but at the same token, if you don't shave one day, you can get in trouble for that. I'm not saying it's good to be clean shaven or whatever. I'm just saying there's actually less discipline. Um, and then the other thing is, if you do actually have the misfortune of going to a war zone, you obviously run the risk of being maimed or killed, subjected to the government healthcare system, which is not very good. And if you talk to any veterans, they will tell you that. Very interesting that the government really can't even take care of these people who they owe the most, and yet there's so many in this society who think it would just be all our problems would be solved if they would just take care of everybody. They can't take care of the troops. What makes you thinks they can take care of everybody else? It's totally ridiculous. On the other hand, they all commit suicide, and that's the other weird thing about my friends. Um, they have their group of friends who are they know outside the military, and their military group of friends. In a lot of ways, they are bound to those military friends in a way, deeper than they are to their non-military friends in most cases. But some of those bonds are terrible because they share things like death. They share things about losing friends, dying horribly, and they also share. I mean, he literally has 10 friends who have committed suicide. 10 people who he has known, that he has worked with, that have committed suicide. I I don't have any friends who have ever committed suicide. I know of one person who did, and he had terminal cancer that he fought for years, and he committed suicide. I didn't even know him very well. And that's the situation, like, okay, well, it almost makes sense. These are people who are coming back, and they're just messed up. And I'll be sitting with him, and his phone will ring, and it'll be another buddy of his, and they'll start talking about so-and-so tried to commit suicide, so-and-so did commit suicide. And it's like, it's not a secret that this is an epidemic in the military right now, and among former military people. And yet, that's not in the commercials. That's not what they tell the 15, 16-year-old kids. They promise you 5 figures, which sounds like a lot, but it's not when you consider how many years you basically give up your freedom. Um, so it's not. I mean, you don't want to chide the government for lying because it's kind of like advertising, but that's what they're doing. And then they have the reason it's worse than regular advertising is there's this whole ethos of patriotism that augments their advertising in a way that normal advertisers just cannot get, because they don't have a public school system that's out there ingraining the efficacy of this. And it's interesting the deference that's paid, the politeness that's paid to the military. People can bitch about the liberal education establishment of higher education, but other than a few radical professors who I think are mostly in it just to generate headlines, when I was in college, the attitude of the university towards enlistment and towards the military was exceptionally deferential and positive. Military recruiters were always welcome. I know in my high school they were always welcome. They were a fixture. They were always there, casting their reels, to bring in these young guys who are just going to end up with demented extended childhoods, basically, on net. It's not like their experiences were wholly negative. And my friends, they're jaded in a lot of ways, and I've pushed them as far as I'm willing to do, maintaining civility, which I have pushed them pretty far, and some more than others, because just frankly, some people are more willing to do that. But I mean, one of my other friends, gosh, I mean, he's back, and I mean, he's literally at home, no job, asking people for work, and he was in the military for I think 6 or 7 years, successful in the military, and now. And he's a smart guy, and I mean, and this is the other interesting thing. A lot of people join the military kind of as a result of failing at their other ambitions. Um, I have another friend who tried at college. He couldn't do it. He couldn't do it. Just couldn't stick to it. I don't know what the problem was, and so he just joined the military. they're going to take him as long as he's not too old yet. And I've known that story a couple times. So if it's such a an experience that's so uplifting and challenging, why is it that so many people who fail at relatively simple tasks like getting a college degree, which they are colleges, most colleges, this isn't true of every college and every program, so please someone don't come on here and say, well, I went to such and such and this program blah, blah, denies half the applicants. Okay, fine, but by and large, universities are diploma mills, just like public schools are diploma mills. Um, so holding down a job that can pay the rent is not a, an extremely difficult task, and yet there are people who don't manage it, and so they start working for Uncle Sam, and that's kind of like that's not the elite club. Now, it's a huge bureaucracy. There's millions of people in the military, and so within that population, there are certainly exceptional people. So there are very high functioning, very intelligent, very successful people in there. I'm sure it's a huge bureaucracy. I'm sure that's going to happen, but relative to the rest of the population, I think it's probably even below average. And I don't mean that like an IQ or anything. Oh, that's probably true too. It's below average just in accomplishment of life. Achieving of human fulfillment, it's less. And that's not an environment that you're going to really flourish in. If you really want to become in shape, you don't need the military for that. If you want to become an expert with firearms, you don't need the military for that. It's a good, cheap way to learn. Cheap for the firearm aspect, not because if it's not cheap if you consider all the stuff that goes with it. I mean, I was just talking to him the other day, and he was just saying, like, the idea that everyone in the military is proficient at firearms use is absurd. He goes, the vast majority of people have extremely basic instruction that they forget right away. If they are not in a situation where they have to use it very often, and most of them are not, then it's similar to taking your chemistry test and chemistry final in high school. Maybe you learned it enough to get a C plus or to pass or whatever it is, and then you forget about it. It doesn't apply to everyone in the military. Just like if you went on to get a degree in chemistry, you probably retain more of that stuff, but the average military person doesn't. They don't all stay in shape, which is pretty obvious, and they don't really learn how to function in the market. The idea that they can get fired, the idea that things can change. I mean, I'll give the government one thing: it offers you a lot of certainty if you are willing to be a cog in its machine. Although ultimately they hold the purse strings there too, and they can fuck you there too, which they do. And I'm glad my friends are all cynical enough, or I should say rather realistic enough, to recognize that. They still kind of, it's interesting how much they can get fucked and still have a net positive view of the institution. And I, as much as I read about history and stuff, I'm pretty deferential to them and say, okay, you have firsthand experience. I don't. I remember, last night I was talking to them all about NCOs and COs and promotion structure, and I had heard Lou Rockwell say once, and Lou Rockwell, I respect him a lot, but he doesn't have firsthand experience in the military, although I guess he gets deluged by emails from military people. He basically said, look, in the military, anything above colonel is political. To be a general, that's a political position. That's something that you get because you have a constituency in Congress, you have congressmen or a president or somebody who politically endorses you. And it's completely divorced from any kind of usefulness in terms of the military bureaucracy other than, and I asked him, is that true? Are generals politicians, and below that it's a little bit more, like you would imagine? He goes, that's absolutely right. That's 100% accurate. The generals are politicians, and so that's who your boss is, becomes the politicians. It's interesting how many of these military guys don't like Obama, but yet he's their he's their commander in chief. I can't can't tell you how many of them are on my Facebook who will post things about, all this recent gun control stuff. Man, this is horrible. I remember one, the day Obama got elected. He's like, I can't believe where my country's going. This is sickening, blah, blah, blah. And what does he do is he volunteers to basically be Obama's fucking slave. To be bound by his orders. I mean, there's an oath to the Constitution. That's interesting how that's in there, and yet in practical terms, an oath to the Constitution seems to mean nothing. I mean, you're bound to follow orders. And, the oath to the Constitution seems to have no inhibiting of doing that, whatever those orders happen to be. So it's interesting how these people can be anti-government in a lot of ways, anti-Obama particularly, and then like willingly sign up. And that's because there's this whole ideology supporting the military and lionizing it, and you see all the commercials, and I mean, and just Hollywood and movies have just been, I mean, it's not like every portrayal of the military is flattering. That's certainly not the case. In fact, there's some very famous, well-known cinema that takes the opposite view, but in general in society there's nothing more lionized. If we get attacked by aliens or foreign invaders, it's going to be the military and all the heroes, and this is their chance to to be that, to actually be a movie. So you can't be a superhero, but you can join the Marines for sure. And as it turns out, you really can't be a superhero, and being in the Marines or the military just means you're joining a federal bureaucracy, and you're just a government worker who is a slave to the wills of politicians who will, quite frankly, throw your life away for the dumbest of political ends that could have no plausible connection to serving the country.